Let me start by thanking all the organizers of this conference. Robert Boyer, thank you very much, and all the wonderful logistical work that went into planning of this. It's a pleasure for me to be here. Am I okay without speaking in the mic? It's all right? Okay. And I will try to keep the talk as short as possible to allow for Q&A. I think that's the most engaging part of the discussion anyways. But let me begin by saying that in the past 20 years, the circuits of Asian capital, migration, and cultural production have transformed Latin America. The signs are ubiquitous. Mexican supermarkets are now filled with everyday products from Asia, and the packages are often written in Chinese. Korean popular culture and soap operas are widely distributed and watched throughout Latin America. Cuba has been investing heavily in revitalizing its Chinatown to attract Chinese tourism. Costa Rica got a soccer stadium funded by the PRC state in exchange for diplomatic relations. Perhaps the most surreal example for me is the Chinese-Nicaraguan Canal, which was a 19th century pipe dream that finally materialized in the 21st century. These are but a few examples reflecting the massive economic and cultural presence of Chinese sweeping across Latin America today. Alongside these socioeconomic transformations is the emergence of unprecedented scholarly materials. In the last decade, we have witnessed an explosion of academic conferences and networks specifically dedicated to the subject of Asians in Latin America. And here are just a few examples of the books that have been published in the last 10 years or 10 or 15 years. So, let me start then by proceeding into what I came to say, which is to start by using the hemispheric as a heuristic device. Okay, what I want to do here then is just to first let me say what I'm not trying to do with it before I say what I am trying to do with it. And by the hemispheric framing, I'm not using it as a replacement for a traditional unit of analysis, such as the nation state or the region of South America or the Caribbean or Latin America. I do not mean to use the hemispheric to simply connote an expansion of scalar analysis. Instead, by using the hemispheric as a heuristic device, I want to treat the hemispheric as a model, a sort of experimental apparatus to learn about the dynamics and forces that affect the links that link Asians throughout the Americas. Here, I do not take the hemispheric as an assumed, a priori, empirical object of analysis, but to treat it as an imperfect and transitional tool that seeks to uncover both the shared and divergent experiences of Asians in the Americas, as well as the links that bind them together. In a manner of speaking, I use the spatial framing of the Americas to simulate comparative and relational analysis across the hemisphere. One of the advantages of such a framing is that it calls attention to north-south relations, as well as east-west dynamics, or what we call the Trans-Pacific. One of the concept of the Americas, then, is more of a tool, a portal that potentially leads to a set of new research questions and inquiries. In using the Americas as a heuristic device, I suggest that there are 3 sites where hemispheric dynamics explicitly manifest themselves and therefore demand a hemispheric analysis. They are circulations, social networks, and Asian racialization. The remainder of my talk will focus on sketching out these 3 sites. Before proceeding, though, I have 2 caveats to make. And one is that I strive to create a general picture of the different Asian groups in the Americas, but the primary focus will be on the Chinese. And second, given the limited time and the broad scope of this talk, this will be merely a sketch, a skeletal framework, an outline of sorts that is meant to incite discussion and to provoke conversation. First, circulations. By circulations, I refer to both trans-Pacific and hemispheric routes. What I'm trying to do here is to supplement the dominant paradigm of looking at trans-Pacific migrations and circulations between the East and the West. And I want to do is to add a hemispheric perspective, the North and the South here, and that, as soon as Asians arrived to the first site in the Americas, they began to circulate throughout the Americas. And they, in a sense, they are engaging in serial migration, and that they're sort of hopping from place to place and site to site throughout the Americas. And what this does is it further complicates our understanding of migrations beyond just a circular trans-Pacific migration, but one that is hemispheric as well. So in speaking of trans-Pacific migrations, however, I've determined 4 different periods of migration. I think it always begins, in Asia first. So let me start there to talk about these migrations. The 4 periods of migration. And what I'll do is I will go ahead and document these 4 as I go forward. The first period, the 16th to 18th centuries. To understand Asians in the Americas, we have to reach back to the 1500s. Conventionally, in the US, when we talk about Asian migration, we often start with the mid-1800s as the first date of arrival of the Asians, especially the Chinese. And that has to do with our own biases, our own use of the US nation state as the primary reference point. Taking a hemispheric approach works against this American chauvinism and insists that our examination must begin with Spanish colonization of the New World and the Manila galleon trade, which began in 1565 and ended in 1815. The Manila galleon trades, often manned by a number of Asian seamen, sailed from Manila, Philippines, across the Pacific to California, then down the coast to Acapulco, Mexico. With this trade route lasting for close to 250 years, it was inevitable that some Chinese and Filipino sailors jumped ship and settled in different parts of the Americas. The Manila men, or the Luzon Indians of the Philippines, serve as one prime example. They most likely jumped ship while sailing the galleons, and in 1763 made present-day New Orleans their home. This is the oldest settlement of Asians in the U.S. As early as the 1600s, there are authorized reports of Chinese servants, textile workers, farmers, and barbers in Mexico City, Acapulco, and the state of Michoacan. In Mexico, documents show that Mira Catarina de San Juan, the much revered Catholic visionary who's also known as La China Poblana, the Chinese woman from Puebla, was abducted as a child from Goa around 1618 and later smuggled to Puebla and sold as a slave. She is in fact a part of a larger Chino slave trade that lasted from the late 1500s to late 1600s. It was in 1672 that the Spanish crown ordered all Chino slaves to be treated under the law as Indians, essentially categorically converting all Chinos to indigenous vassals of the Spanish crown. Rather than being Chino slaves then, this legal categorization meant that they no longer could be held as slaves. Mira Catarina de San Juan's appearance in historical records in many ways disrupts the conventional images of Mexico during the early colonial period. Through her biography, we come to have a very different image of 17th century Mexico. It shows a place where people from different parts of Asia coexisted with Spaniards, indigenous peoples, and blacks, a place where their cultural and religious worlds interacted, clashed, and remade one another. The story of Mira Catarina de San Juan illustrates a much more complex place of multi-layered entanglements than we have previously assumed, and in turn, it opens up a new set of questions about Asian indigenous relations, as well as slavery in relation to race making. The second period of labor migration, essentially in the 19th century, primarily dominated by labor, coolie trade, or indentured and contract labor, as well as the early pioneering merchants. The largest Asian labor migration took place between the mid to late 1900s. It is the period characterized by the coolie trade and indentured or contract labor. With the end of the 16th, With the end of the African slave trade came the large numbers of Chinese and Indian coolies to work on the sugar plantations in the Caribbean and the guano pits in the Chincha Islands of Peru. This is why the Barrio Chino in Havana was the largest Chinatown in the hemisphere before the Cuban Revolution of 1959. And Indians still comprise 50% of the total population in Trinidad, Jamaica, and Suriname. By Indians, I'm talking about South Asians here. And I just want to point out that the labor migrations between the Chinese and the Indians are different in terms of gender racial composition. And by that, I mean the Chinese were primarily coming over as men only, as male laborers, whereas the Indian coolies came as couples or families here. So you see in this picture of the Indian coolies a gender mix of men and women working together. Once they arrived in the New World, it was common for groups of Chinese contract laborers to move or to be moved from one location to another. We began to see hemispheric circulations in the mid-1800s. For example, in 1843, a number of Chinese workers from Panama were shipped to Jamaica in exchange for West Indian laborers. In 1867, about 2,000 Chinese laborers were brought from Cuba to Louisiana. From California, one group of Chinese relocated to Mexico to work in mines and construction projects, while another group migrated to Cuba via Mexico and New Orleans in search of a less hostile environment. Also in the late 1800s, we find Cuban Chinese in New York who were reputed to be the city's best cigar rollers. The list goes on. These hemispheric circulations would continue into the present. The third period in the 20th century, before I go to the third period, here are some images of the earlier merchants, the pioneering merchants of the times, going into the laundry business as well as the restaurant and cafe business, among other things, of course. The third period, the 20th century, we see much more of a trans-Pacific circular migration between Asia and the Americas. It is also shaped by China's closed and open door policies, framed by 1949 with the Communist Revolution and 1989 Deng Xiaoping's open door policy. And there's also the immigration policies of the Latin American, the American states, right, where there's quite some contraction in the early periods, the first part of the 20th century, along with expansion or liberalization of immigration laws in the second half of the century. In the 20th century, we began to see these migrations and the split trans-Pacific households. For wealthy merchants, it was common practice to return to China to marry and bring back a Chinese wife. It was also common to send to China one's American-born children until they reached an appropriate age and they returned to Americas to take over the family businesses. We also see a clear formation of Chinatowns as populations stay and forge community. I should add that in contrast to popular notions of the Chinese preferring to stick together or to isolate themselves from the rest of the community, it is more the case that Chinatowns form and emerge as a result of imposed spatial segregation by the governments. Also, depending on migration policies and the treatment of Chinese, the size and vibrancy of Chinatowns varied. Not all Chinatowns flourished. For instance, despite the long historical presence of Chinese in Mexico, the Barrio Chino there is only 2 blocks long. This is due to the anti-Chinese movement that began in the 1910s and that culminated in 1930 with the expulsion of approximately 70% of the entire Chinese population from Mexico. The Chinese and their Mexican wives and children left Mexico for other parts, for the U.S. or to go back to China. To this day, the Chinese population in Mexico remains relatively small compared to populations in Peru and Panama, for instance. Similarly, the Chinese in Cuba left for Florida and New York and in other places in the U.S. in large numbers after the Cuban Revolution. The political climate and immigration policies in Latin America then were factors in shaping Chinese migration routes throughout the Americas. The outmigration of Chinese was also affected by China's political situation. Between the Chinese Communist Revolution in 1949 and China's open policy in 1989, Chinese migration was restricted. Few Chinese returned to China and few left. For those who migrated and stayed in the Americas, many of the descendants have made their mark in their respective countries. Here are a few exemplary Chinese Latin Americans worth noting. Does anyone know any of these figures, or all of these figures, rather? Ana Gabriel, who is a singer, a famous singer in Mexico. Mother is of Chinese descent. Keiko Fujimori, who is Alberto Fujimori's daughter, who just recently ran for the presidency. Arlen Siu, a martyr of the Sandinista revolution in Nicaragua. And Wilfredo Lam at that corner, who is the famous artist, Afro-Chinese Cuban artist, right? Of course, Asians have also made their mark in other cultural forms, such as food. The chifas in Peru, as Isabel knows, and many of you do, are considered to be a central part of Panamanian national cuisine. Of course, as Chinese Latin American or Asian Latin Americans migrate and move to the U.S., we see another culinary twist. Here we see the plethora of Asian Latino fusion cuisine, Chinese Cuban, Chinese Peruvian, Japanese Peruvian, and Korean Mexican foods that are now emerging all over in primarily New York, Texas, and California, and Florida. These culinary inventions are clear indicators that mark Asian Latino hemispheric circulations, as well as the cultural complexities they embody. The fourth period, which is the most recent 21st century, is where you have China's many projects, global projects, all over Latin America. What we see currently unfolding is another wave of Chinese migration. They comprise of diplomats, transnational investors, technocrats, and skilled laborers who help build China's many infrastructural projects. The examples here include the Coca-Cola Sinclair Dam in Ecuador, the projected railways in Peru and Brazil, the soccer stadium that I mentioned earlier in Costa Rica, and the Nicaraguan canal that is still underway. So these are the huge projects that are bringing a new wave of Chinese migrants into Latin America. Moving on to the second site of analysis, which is social networks, transnational organizations, and kinship ties. First, the long and sustained history of migrant circulation across the Americas has given rise to hemispheric-wide social networks forged by kinship throughout the Americas. In my research, a typical migration story, starting with a grandfather's initial arrival to Peru, would invoke memories of distant relatives still living there, uncles and aunts who had moved to Houston, Los Angeles, and Toronto, and cousins who were attending school in Miami and Mexico. In many ways, these migration stories passed from one generation to another provide a common framework through which ethnic Chinese come to understand the relationship to those places as well as to one another. They map kinship relations across different locales. allowing the Americas to emerge as a significant spatial imaginary for community formation. These stories both reflect and transmit a distinct cultural knowledge that is simultaneously personal and collective, illustrative and pedagogical. Holidays, weddings, and other special occasions provide the perfect excuse to bring together the extended family dispersed from all over the Americas. During Christmas holidays, families converge to celebrate, eat, dance, sing, karaoke, and just spend time together after a long period of separation. These occasions help renew ties, generate new memories, and tighten bonds. These bonds are further reinforced by smaller gatherings throughout the year, as well as by communication via telephone, emails, and of course, Facebook. To the extent that family members continue to participate in these family gatherings and maintain communication, these kinship networks, however dispersed they may be, will continue to generate sentiments, memories, and practices of hemispheric sociality, therefore also producing a sort of hemispheric consciousness. Overlapping these kinship networks are formal organizations that play an important role in facilitating transnational ties among diasporic Asians. For the Chinese, a set of organizations co-sponsored by the Republic of China government, the government in Taiwan, has long created opportunities for regular meetings and sustained relations among dispersed communities. Ranging in scale, these organizations include first the nation-based associations, which then act as an umbrella group organization that oversee all the civic organizations, the educational organizations, the religious organizations, the home-based organizations, etc. Then you have the formation of these three other types of organizations. You have the Federation of the Chinese in Central America and Panama that meet every other year. You have the Federation of the Chinese in the Americas that meet also every other year. And you have a global Cantonese organization that meet regularly as well. And these are all co-sponsored by the Taiwanese government, the ROC government based in Taiwan, I should say. Of particular interest to our discussion is the Federation of Chinese in the Americas, which meets annually at a designated city somewhere in the Americas. Some of the sites where these conventions have taken place include Oakland, California, San Juan, Puerto Rico, Panama City, Panama, and Toronto, Canada. Representatives from Chinese communities all over the Americas are invited, and many bring their families with them and make it a family vacation. These three-day conventions offer an organized venue for diasporic Chinese across the hemisphere to establish contact and to maintain communication, to gain mutual understanding of each community's challenges and accomplishments, to share best practices of how to negotiate with the state, and offer collective support for those in need. While the intended goal of the association is to establish a hemispheric-wide support network for diasporic Chinese, the actual effects produced by these conventions are multiple and sometimes contradictory. Certainly, on one level, these conventions nurture and help produce a sense of shared collectivity. In addition to building formal alliances across diasporic communities, informal friendships, even romances would develop, resulting in another set of informal social relations. On another level, participants also come to realize the hierarchies that exist within the Chinese diaspora, unequal power relations, and the uneven distribution of resources among the Chinese communities. Nonetheless, these conventions, by the nature of them, of the very repetition, they happen every so often, and the orchestration of a hemispheric-wide gathering, they help produce relations, social relations. They help produce the memories. They help produce the cultural imaginaries of relatedness and affiliation that are necessary in thinking, in imagining, and in acting hemispherically. Analogous to this organization, the Chinese organization, is the Japanese is the Japanese Pan-American Nikkei Association, which consists of people of Japanese descent living in 13 countries. And here you have listed all of them. And note that Japan is also there as a co-sponsoring government of this organization as well. And I'll just note here that, like the Diasporic Chinese organization, this one also meets regularly and at different locales throughout the Americas, and it's also co-sponsored by the homeland state. The co-sponsorship of both organizations by either the Chinese state or the Japanese state raises a set of interesting questions about the nature of relationship between these governments and the diasporic subjects. There's a lot more to say about this relationship, and I hope to get to it perhaps in the Q&A, but I would like to move on to the third discussion. So I'll just say that this reinforces, not only does it reinforce the ties of the diasporas throughout the Americas, they also reinforce the ethnic ties between the homeland state as well as the ethnic diasporic communities. So the third section on Asian racialization. And there are multiple ways then that Asians are racialized, but here I'll just focus my discussion on two perhaps divergent representations. One of foreigners and alien enemies in some ways, and on the other hand, the global idealized citizen, right? Although national ideologies differ across the Americas, with the U.S. representing itself as a melting pot of diverse cultures, Canada adopting and espousing, adopting a multiculturalism, and most of Latin America and the Caribbean espousing mestizaje or creolization. And these are, of course, generalities. There remains tremendous resonance in the racialization of Asians as perpetual foreigners. Historians have shown how racial stereotypes of the Chinese as unfit citizens spread from the U.S. to Canada and Mexico in the late 1800s, and how these states all adopted restrictive immigration policies against the Chinese. I should add also that the exclusion of Chinese was followed by the exclusion of the Japanese and South Asians. Moreover, anti-Chinese movements and immigration policies were much more widespread, affecting the Chinese in Mexico, in Panama, in Costa Rica, in Peru, and in Jamaica. Take the case of Mexico's anti-Chinese campaign, and I just want to focus here. What we see in the following are visual representations that emerged around the time of the Mexican Revolution. Well, shortly after the revolution, I should say, in the 19-teens and 1920s here. And what we see are themes that cut across the Americas here, and these are just examples. Notice the figuration of the face, the apish look, the grotesque kind of deformation. Here you see, Chinese as engaging in drug dealing as a vice, right? And you have also Chinese as violent and as engaging in senseless violence, right? The other is that they live and they work in unsanitary conditions and environments. These are themes, right? As the rise of public health became important in the beginning of the 20th century, you also see the themes of health and sanitation being significant in the way they construct Asian Chineseness, for instance. And diseases, right? Another sort of key theme that used to characterize the contagion, the disease body of the Chinese. Here, here you have the terrible syphilis, trachoma, and lepra, that is part of the Chinese body, and that it's hidden behind the clothing. So there's also the fear. In addition to these fears of public health, you also have the fear of the Chinese presenting a biopolitical threat, a biopolitical, it is the biopolitical threat to the nation in that as they intermarry with Mexican women, they produce offsprings that are weaker, deformed, and apish looking as well. Their wives become emaciated after 5 years between the wedding day and 5 years later, disheveled and drained of any kind of virility in life. And the children, as you see, are mongrel-looking, apish-looking, deformed, and weak. And here are more pictures of the same kind of theme, of this kind of the threat of the future production of the nation here, where if you have the Chinese engaging in intermarriage, this is the production of the future of the Mexican nation, which you do not want. On the other picture, you see the contrast between the ideal Indian and Latino blend, the Ladino, the indigenous and European offspring, as compared with the Chinese Mexican offspring here. Okay, hold on one second. Indeed, U.S. cultural and political hegemony influence in the hemisphere is well known, starting with the Monroe Doctrine of 1823 that set the stage for American domination over the entire hemisphere. If it is indisputable that the U.S. has influenced Latin American national politics, then it is also the case that it has left its imprint on the treatment of ethnic Asians throughout the region. Racial representations that mobilize support for exclusion is one key area to examine. However, a most egregious example is the Japanese internment during World War II, when the U.S. recruited the cooperation of 13 Latin American countries to apprehend, detain, and to deport residents of Japanese descent. And here you have the fascist Japanese being illustrated in these images, and more images of the Japanese in these very caricatured and grotesque ways. In the name of hemispheric, security, around 2,264 Japanese Latin Americans were interned in the U.S., and more than 865 were shipped to Japan as part of the U.S.-Japan hostage exchange program. At the end of the war, the majority of Japanese Latin Americans remained in the U.S. to fight for a suspension of deportation with the hope of returning to Peru. In the end, only 100 of them were able to return, while the majority simply resolved their illegal alien status and remained in the U.S. As the U.S. wielded its power across the Americas, it made Japanese internment not just a national issue, but a hemispheric one. These examples, the Chinese exclusion and Japanese internment, evidence not only American hegemony in shaping hemispheric-wide responses to Asian migration and belonging in the Americas, but also the transnational racialization of Asians as perpetual foreigners, manifested in the form of prohibited aliens and untrustworthy, disloyal subjects. These examples show how juridical law, political action, and cultural representation work together to reinforce one another, drawing racial and cultural boundaries between who belongs and who does not belong in the Americas. In the past few decades, with the unprecedented economic growth of China, Japan, Korea, and India, the perpetual foreigner stereotype has taken another form. Pushing aside representations of Asians as unwanted aliens, stereotypes of the model minority, and discourses of the ideal global citizen have become dominant characterizations of Asians throughout the Americas. In the case of Japanese Brazilians and Chinese Americans, and Asian Americans, I should say, you have the perception, the stereotyping of Asians as model minorities. As anthropologist Gaku Suda has shown, ethnic Japanese in Brazil are perceived to be a positive minority and are praised for their intelligence, discipline, and strong work ethic. Suda also notes that the manner in which the Japanese constructions of ethnic Japanese parallel the nation's perceptions of Japan. In other words, the cultural variation of ethnic Japanese as the positive minority rests on the perceived first world status of Japan, their presumed ethnic homeland. In this case, in this sense, the very characterizations or characteristics that they praised are attributed to their essentialized connections to a foreign country and culture. While some Japanese Brazilians embrace this cultural construction, others are keenly aware of the essentializing undertones that work to incorporate ethnic Japanese into Japan on the very basis of their cultural alienation from the nation. A similar scenario is unfolding in Panama. With increased Chinese investments in Panama since the 1990s, ethnic Chinese have risen in national status as the ideal global citizen who will presumably act as the cultural brokers and bridge builders between Panama and China. This recent perception contrasts sharply against that of the late 1980s and early 1990s when Chinese immigrants were treated as undesirable subjects. Within less than a decade, the perception and treatment of ethnic Chinese had changed dramatically. Now, Chinese culture, whether it is manifested in the form of language, Mandarin, values and practices, or simply Chinese food, clothing, or martial arts, has suddenly become something to be valued, acquired, and emulated. It seems with the changing global status of China in the world, and more specifically the role of Chinese capital in Latin America and the Americas more generally, ideas of cultural Chineseness have been dramatically refashioned. And you see this repeated over and over again in different countries throughout Latin America, in Canada, and in the US. However, like Japanese Brazilians, Chinese Panamanians are being embraced on the basis of their cultural difference and connection to the presumed ethnic homeland. This has always been a double-edged sword. As easily as they have become exceptional citizens, they can also turn back to being undesirable subjects. The fact remains that they are perceived as being innately different and forever connected to a culture different from that of true Panamanians or true Brazilians. It is important to note that both their exclusion and inclusion are based on the assumption of essentialized difference. The questions remain, what will happen when China's position in the world changes? How will Chinese Panamanians be perceived and treated then? To be sure, not all Chinese investments are welcomed. The cases of the Nicaraguan Canal and the Brazilian railroad constructions are instructive here. At this juncture, there are divergent representations that shape perceptions of Chineseness and Asianness more generally. On the one hand, China is often seen as a potential threat. Here you have plenty of scholarly and popular writings on China as threat here. And these are only a small sample of what has been published. You have images like this. We have the dragon that is about to consume the Christ in Brazil, in Rio. And in some cases, you also see that, that you have the Chinese replacing the U.S. As the imperial force in the region. So these are ongoing discourses and representations of what the Chinese are represented in Latin America. What may be working to counterbalance these images of threat and fear is the stream of Asian popular culture that is flowing into Latin America. In fact, Korean films, TV shows, and music have become vastly popular throughout the Americas. Drama Fever, a video streaming platform best known for Korean films and TV shows, saw its watch time in Latin America increase by 250% in 2015. Latin America now accounts for 30% of Drama Fever's total audience. What happens when one begins to relate, to understand, and perhaps even identify with the Chinese characters on the screen, and with the values and desires that are being projected on the screen? It seems that with discourses of threat and fear that emanate from the U.S. about the Chinese state and its growing investments in the region, Latin Americans are developing their own forms of engagement with Chinese culture, people, and politics. The future remains uncertain at the same time that it remains full of potential. To conclude here, briefly, what I've offered in this talk is a hemispheric approach to studying Asians in the Americas. This approach provides an analysis of north-south dynamics to supplement the dominant east-west perspective. This, I suggest, allows us to see the triangulating forces among Latin America, the United States, and Asia in shaping the lives of diasporic Asians in the Americas. Second, specifically, I've examined 3 sites where hemispheric dynamics become explicitly apparent. First, Asians not only circulate between Asia and the Americas, but they also circulate across the Americas as well. Their movement across the space of the hemisphere helps inform their cultural imaginary of home and belonging in the Americas. Second, their migrations extend their kinship networks across the Americas. And furthermore, transnational social organizations, which are often co-sponsored by ethnic homeland states, help generate ethnic bonds across the Americas, as well as strengthen the ties between the diaspora and their ethnic homeland. Third, Asian racialization, which is produced by visual representation, law and policy, and political practice, has been mediated and perpetuated by U.S. hegemony. With the decline of U.S. influence in Latin America, China and Latin America may finally have a chance to develop a relationship that is not mediated through and by the U.S. With the increase of Asian economic, political, and cultural presence, it seems new possibilities are in the horizon. Of course, without a crystal ball, only time will tell. Thank you.
Thank you for this new view of immigration and migration of Asians in the Americas. We have time for questions and discussion.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor SIU. I was wondering on 2 or 3 things. One, I very much agree with you that these Asia and Latin America studies do not need to necessarily include the United States. There is a lot of research in Asia and in Latin America in this regard. I am skeptic, and I'm asking you for your opinion. If today it is possible, it is feasible, and you get to relevant results studying Asia and Latin America and even China and Latin America, given the huge differences from the Malvinas to Mexicali. No? Because, again, we've been working for 20 years on this relationship only on China. I coordinate the Center for Chinese-Mexican Studies, and the more we do, the less we understand. No? And so if you do Asia, Latin America, it's a 40 by 30 relationship. If you do only China and Latin America, you end up saying very little, particularly if you see the huge richness of results. We recently participated with Alejandro Portes and Ariel Harmony on an immigration research with Min Chou from UCLA. And well, in the case of Mexico, China, you end up with a huge richness of Chinese migration today, a group of differences in history only for the Mexican case, no? And regarding transnational representations, etc. So my question is, 20 years ago, maybe it was relevant to discuss China and Latin America. Today, if you find out all the results that you have from business organizations in China, in Latin America, in Buenos Aires, still discussing China and Latin America, is it worth it? Do you get interesting, relevant results, or do you end up with generalities that maybe are very shallow? And I say it with all humility.
No, absolutely. You're speaking to a cultural anthropologist, so I'm converted in terms of the details. You know, the grounds, from the ground up kind of analysis and studies. I absolutely, applaud that. You know, my own research is based in Panama, as you know, itself a very small, a relatively small country, but with a huge influence of the Chinese. And that case study is immensely rich and constantly changing. However, my approach here in terms of thinking about a hemispheric framework is not to gloss over and say these are, a large generality, but it is precisely a device for us to think comparatively and relationally. That's the main point that I'm trying to get across here, is that if we were to extract and abstract it to think of it as a larger scope, what do we see differently that a narrowing down of a small case study cannot show? And this is to say, generate the kind of questions that we can begin to think by, and generating new questions and new ways of inquiring about what other new questions should we ask in the future. It's, this is purely an apparatus, not a goal of constructing a universal theory of any kind. I'm not supporting that at all, but it's really a tool, a mediating tool to generate questions about comparativity, about relationality, about of the different locations, the different ethnic groups, as well as across time. So I'm not at all opposed to the detailed research. In fact, I applaud it. I support it. I'm, in fact, in many other occasions would lean toward that. But in this situation, my interventions are different, which is to think about it as a north-south intervention that complements the east-west, and to allow for the variations to come across and to see what places can we look for to think about relationality, to think about comparativity. So, thank you.
Thank you very much for your presentation.
It's good to see you again.
My pleasure to see you again. We met a few days ago in LASA, in the Latin American Studies Association meeting in New York. And I think that your presence here, but also in LASA, it's a sign of the evolution of the field of Asian or East Asian or China or Sichuan relations with Latin America or with specific countries in Latin America. It's a proof of the evolution of the field. For people that we have been doing research on this relationship from a long time, like Enrique and me, that this kind of conversation was totally separate from the conversation of the economic relationship or the political relationship. I think it's wonderful to have this integration of the topics. When I wrote about China, Latin America, Argentina, China, in the book of the Woodrow Wilson Center, of course, my field is international relations and political economy, but I had to cover a little bit about the presence of these communities in Argentina because it's an essential part of the relationship. So you touched several important issues, but important footnote, we have a section in LASA that is very powerful now, although it was not the case some years ago. Enrique has been a chair, I have been a chair of this section, and we have a pre-LASA, a specific meeting the day before LASA, we have done for in 5 occasions already, with very specific concentration of topics. And we plan to have one, of course, in the next LASA in Lima next year in Peru. I think that this is an important part of this evolution also of the field. You touch several important issues that I think are important. The issue of the circulation, I think, is really very important. The most simple idea was that some person from Asia came to a Latin American country just as a stepping stone in order to go to Canada or the United States. But the internal circulation in Latin America, I think, it's becoming increasingly important as a focus of the research. If you go to a Korean restaurant in Mexico City, probably the Korean who will talk with you will be speaking in perfect porteño, because probably this Korean immigrated from Buenos Aires to Mexico, and not directly from Korea to Mexico. This issue of the circulation inside Latin America, I think it's quite important. But for people like myself doing international relations and political economy, I think that at the end of your presentation, you touched a very important subject, that is the role or the potential role of the communities as bridges or mediators in the big relationship between the nation states, right? You barely touched on this. Mm-hmm. I think that the expectations about this had been a little bit maybe overblown. I have seen a role that have been different maybe of what was initially speculated maybe 10 years ago or 15 years ago. I don't know if you have done research on this, or if you are familiar of other colleagues doing this kind of research, but I would be really very interested to hear some comments on this, the potential role as mediators of bridges between the country of origin and the country in which they are living now. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a great question, and in my research, I'll revert to my research in Panama specifically, where I conducted many years ago. But it has very much to do with how the Chinese, the diasporic Chinese, really have an incredible role in mediating the kinds of conversations, the bilateral conversations between Panama and China. And by China here, I'm also talking about two Chinas, right? The ROC and the PRC. One of the key things that have occurred, in the recent few decades, is the realization now that all of a sudden, with all the Chinese capital, you have a much more a higher, increased presence of the Chinese state involved. And Panamanian politicians and officials have not historically have a long existing relationship or understand the forms of engagement with mainland China. This is where a lot of times the politicians actually extend to the diasporic Chinese to ask about the formalities, about the roles, about how to make certain decisions and how to create certain relationships, And for the diasporic Chinese in Panama, they have stepped up to play that role. And crucially, they were asked at one point where, should Panama change diplomatic relations, from Taiwan to mainland China? And because of the long existing relationship that the Chinese have had with the Taiwanese embassy, and because of how overseas Chinese were treated in China after the Communist Revolution, one of persecution and violence, the diasporic Chinese in Panama actually advised Panamanian politicians, to not change these political relations. And they also realized that in doing so, they actually get both sides. They have, by continuing this tension of, vying for power between Taiwan and China, you have a spiraling effect of economic, financial support from both states. And this is where you find out, where you see certain key diasporic Chinese politicians, elites, business merchants, etc., be very key critical players, in a Panamanian sort of landscape. Panama is a particular case. It's a much smaller country, and when we think about the state, it's important to also see it not as a monolithic. What is the state? They're comprised of people. They comprise of networks. They comprise of institutions, etc. And this is where you begin to see how the Chinese have been inserted into these spaces of influence, of political influence, and how they have worked to play that role very successfully. It's an exceptional case. I don't know of other diasporic Chinese communities that have played to that extent, in other parts of the Americas. I would say that, oftentimes the Panamanian Chinese are sort of set up as the example of diasporic Chinese and their relationship to the ROC as the example of how those homeland state diaspora relationships should be. It's very tightly intertwined. But, in terms of other places and how diasporic Chinese have played that role, I have not seen any kind of ethnographic work. And I would have to say the field right now is dominated by, the international relations, macro perspectives, of China's investments and influence in Latin America. And then you have a field of historians, pioneering work done by Evelyn Hude-Hart to all the new research that's done, primarily history. And you also have a segment that is coming out with literature. But the ethnographic, the contemporary, up close, grounds up kind of research is still sort of lagging behind. It's forthcoming, but it's lagging behind. But that's the kind of research, the on the ground, mingling with the community and seeing how they actually work and how they actually negotiate their situation is one that requires a certain set of skills and methodologies, the languages, the trust. Those are crucial, not easy to do. And it takes a certain set of individuals, that is able to kind of insert themselves and be able to get into those communities to learn about the inner workings and the political strategizing that happens. So I hope it comes more.
No, I think that you have a great point that the rise of China or the visibility of China, it's a powerful country in the world, had helped the communities inside the countries to gain also visibility and to have some kind of protection, implicit protection, right? But it's also a source of engagement of China. We have to remember that the first diplomatic relations that the imperial China had with Latin American countries was because of the workers in Cuba. The first treaties that imperial China signed in the world was as with some degree of independence was with Latin American countries because of these workers. So in other way, and I have made this point in analyzing the relationship between Taiwan and Latin America and China, Latin America, that Latin American country has always been exporters of recognition, exporter of legitimacy. And so, but there are these political consequences of the fact that these communities are located in Latin American countries. We have to remember that in Libya, China had to remove the complete Chinese population in Libya because of the situation a few years ago. So there are several implications of the presence of this community. But still, maybe with the exception that you pointed in Panama, I think that the expectations had fell short in the sense that the community had not been such an actor in bringing China and any Latin American country together. They have received the benefits, maybe, of more business opportunities as translators or, helping Chinese companies to establish in these countries. But my feeling, again, I'm not a researcher in this area, but my feeling is that the communities, there was a high expectation, and the communities haven't been an actor, have been more a subject of the relationship than an actor of the relationship. Thank you.
Yeah.
Three questions. Why, just what you are Chinatown, not Japantown? What are the forms of sociality the same all over Asia, for Taiwanese, for Korean? Second question, the fourth epoch is a collective epoch in which the Chinese state is inducing firms to go abroad, bringing their own manpower and so on. It shifts from an individual move to a collective move. So do you notice some change in the way the community is behaving, because the circumstances are not at all the same? And third question, do you have in some country an absorption of Chinese-born, Asian-born into the elite? Or do we still continue to have like enclave or diaspora? So what is the balance between full integration and the fact that they still belong as a diaspora, and do you see difference among countries in this respect?
Oh, those are three great questions, and let me just try to recall them right now. The first one is about why Chinatowns and not Japantowns, right? And the second question is, I forget.
The new epoch, now Chinese come along with multinational projects and so on. So it's not more the same process as coolies, as slaves, and individuals. So you're having a big shift.
Okay.
The motives.
The motivations, the different motives of migration, and how it affects the diversity of the community. And the third one is about what is full integration versus diaspora. Okay, sure. For the first one, Chinatowns versus Japantowns. There are Japantowns. They are, but they are less marked in that sense than Chinatowns. And a lot of the Chinatowns, you know, the grand gates, etc., those are new. Those are new pronouncements. Really, since many of these are 1980s in Latin America. You know, they're built as a result of China's rise in Latin America, and many of those are funded by the Chinese state. So the pronouncement of the Chinatown, like for instance in Cuba, sure, you had a street, you know, that was part of where the Chinese were, the Sangha, where they have the Chinese congregated. But it wasn't until they placed the gates where you have the grandiose notion of Chinatown, right? And you see this as sort of the signature, you know, of Chinatowns all over the world, not just the Americas, but all over the world, right? Japan does not have the same kind of architectural marker of its site necessarily, but they still nonetheless, there are congregations of them. And you can see them, for instance, in Brazil, you know, in Liberdade, right, which is known as the area where the Japanese live and where also the Koreans and the Chinese are also moving into. It doesn't have an architectural branding of the Japanese, but nonetheless, people understand it as such. You know, they have the schools, there's a national museum, you know, they have restaurants and commercial areas, you know, around that kind of signal it as Japantowns, but not explicitly, consciously, and perhaps even ostentatiously shown as, you know, ethnic Chinese or ethnic Japanese. The second question in regard to the diversity of the population, yes, there is a huge diversity, lots of tensions, and lots of conflict. You know, you're talking about, going back to Enrique's first point, of the diversity of the Chinese alone in any one location. You have ethnic differences, regional differences. You know, the first group who came from Guangdong, the Cantonese speakers, the Hakkas, the Fujianese, you know, the Northerners, the Beijingers, you know, the Hong Kongese, the Taiwanese, etc. You know, you have that layered on with the religious differences. The Buddhists, you know, the folk religion, the, Christians, the Catholics, etc. So those diversities are very much there. But when you're looking at the migration motivations, they change by ethnicity, by regional, where they're coming from, and also class, right? You're talking about a very different, significant difference between the coolies, the indentured coolies that came over in the 19th century to now, with the transnational elites. And they have a very different sense of what it means to be Chinese. So here again, we have to, dehomogenize and make visible the heterogeneity, of the Chinese, of which migration plays a major factor. And there are, it's not harmonious, at all. It is in fact full of tensions internally. But however, there are moments when you see the community, uniting when it's under threat, and you have those moments where the community is congeals, but then very easily it returns to a state of divisions. And so that is, I think that's the case of any kind of ethnic community, right? That there is no harmonious, that's an idealized form, but it's in fact very contentious and full of divisions. The third question in regard to the full, what's the difference? When does one become fully integrated, and when does one kind of is a diasporic or diasporic subject that relates heavily, much more so with the ethnic homeland than a nation state? And I think this depends on situation and on context. I don't see it as a kind of teleology of the immigrant generation coming in as being, foreign, the second generation becoming more, more American or Panamanian, and the third generation, you lose all signs of language. I don't buy into that developmental discourse of assimilation. I don't buy into that. I think for many of the ethnic communities, you see that their identification of being Panamanian, of asserting themselves as Panamanians or asserting themselves as ethnic Chinese, has to do with the kind of political conditions that they live in. Because I'm telling you, from the time of the 1980s to the present, you have a much larger number of people identifying as Chinese who are coming forward, as saying, who is my great-grandfather is Chinese, and therefore I'm Chinese, right? You see this happening in the case of the Japanese Digasegis, who, in terms of returning to Japan, they have to be third generation, no more than third generation, and they have to show it. And you have many more people coming forward to identify themselves as Japanese in order to have the possibility of migrating back to Japan. And that is something new in the 1980s. The same thing, with the Cuban Chinese, for instance. When the tourism industry picked up and the Cuban state wanted to reinvest in Chinatown, they were giving out funds, and people who can identify as Chinese can actually get jobs, can actually get support. And this is, again, where you have Chinese who are coming forward, who did not perhaps identify as ethnic Chinese, come forward and identify as such for particular, for strategic reasons. So that is to say that ethnicity is a very, it's diverse and it's conditional and it's situational. And these kinds of identifications of asserting oneself as being fully Panamanian or as more of a mediating, diasporic of China or Japan is a fact of the political situation, the geopolitical as well as national conditions. So.
Yes,
very, very short
very
question.
brief. Regarding again this heterogeneity and the dynamism of these migration groups from Asia and from China, in the Mexican, and I would say against the myth of China being homogeneous and
posing the possibility of becoming a bridge. No, we always have this idea of China being relatively homogeneous. In the Mexican case, again, you have many cases and whatsoever. What you find out, and this is why it is interesting to discuss concrete cases and not only regional cases, is what you find out, probably pretty astonishingly for many, is a deep division in the Chinese migration and Chinese institutions, and this runs against this homogeneity, etc. So the picture you showed of the Mexican Chinatown is the official Chinatown, but it's not the real Chinatown of today. In reality, today you have two other Chinatowns, and the one you showed is where the Chinese ambassador goes and they do the New Year and whatsoever. In reality, you have one migration institutions related to the embassy, and the other that is at least as big, that is not being attended and supported by the embassy, including business, including churches, no? And people playing ping pong and whatsoever, and they are not related to the embassy, they are not invited to the New Year, to the 1st of October, etc., etc. And this reflects and is deeply related to a lot of events. And so what you have is a huge division of, and you might have others, and so the possibility of doing a bridge with China is very difficult because the authority that you have in China does not work in Mexico. So is this also the case in other places of Latin America or not really?
The diversity. Oh, okay.
So I'd like to have
Oh. Okay, a short answer. Yes, it's the diversity is there. It's everywhere, right? There's no homogenous Chinese community found anywhere, in the diaspora. So in a sense, what you're asking is who gets to represent, who gets to play the bridge building role? And that has to do, I think, very much has to do with the educated elite, the politically influential elites within the community, the trusted figures of the community. Not everyone will play a role as bridge builder, to China. That's not possible. You're asking for an ideal world that doesn't exist. So there will be key individuals that step up because of the opportunities that are opened up. And is it congruent with the perspective of the entire community? No. And so it really is about a struggle of power within the community to who gets to have this authority to speak for the Chinese, right? To speak as the Chinese, and that's a whole set of hierarchies in place, in the Chinese communities from time immemorial, So, but thank you. All right, is that short enough as an answer?
I think otherwise.